Right, I think we've got a critical mass of great people on the line, so let's get underway. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this discussion about Spotlight on Corruption's brand new and very exciting anti-corruption enforcement tracker. I'm Alex Beattie. I'm Spotlight's communications advisor, and I'll be moderating this afternoon's session. With luck, you won't hear too much from me, as we've got a brilliant panel with us today, and we're all looking forward to what they have to say. But I will just do some quick housekeeping for anyone who isn't that familiar with Google Meet. Firstly, can everyone, except our panelists, of course, please make sure you're on mute throughout today's session so that we can avoid any background noise disturbances. We do hope to have at least 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. You'll see there's a meeting chat function. That's the speech bubble down in the bottom right-hand corner. But because questions in there can quite easily get lost, we hope you'll use the special Q&A function in Google Meet. That's also down there in the bottom right. You'll see an icon with a triangle, a square, and a circle. If you click that and select Q&A, you can enter your questions there. You can even choose to do so anonymously, in case anyone wants to say anything quite controversial. If you like a question that somebody else has already submitted, you can give it a thumbs up to bump it up the list. My colleague James will be keeping an eye on that to make sure we get a great selection of questions. If for any reason your sound isn't great or you're having difficulty keeping up with what the panelists are saying, you can enable live captions using the button in the bottom bar. It's the CC in a box down there. It usually works surprisingly well, so let's see how it gets on today. We were going to be able to try to record this seminar and even to live stream it on YouTube, but unfortunately we've run into the limits of our Google for Nonprofits account. We are attempting a rather steampunk method of recording this session by screen capping the video on a spare laptop. So fingers crossed that works, and we may be able to upload a version for those people who weren't able to make it today, but we'll have to see how that goes. Just to let you know, this is the first time that Spotlight has run one of these online panel discussions, so it is something of an experiment, so do please bear with us. Right, let's get back to our fantastic panelists. I think many will be well known to you, as this is a very knowledgeable audience, so I'll just do the briefest of introductions. Oliver Buller is the author of two fantastic books on corruption and kleptocracy, Moneyland and Butler to the World, as well as much essential journalism in this area. Lindsay Lauer is a Deputy Director at the Home Office, responsible for delivery of the economic crime portfolio. We were hoping to have Detective Superintendent Jim Halkett with us. He's head of the UK's Domestic Corruption Unit at the City of London Police. Jim says he may be able to join us. He does have another commitment. He's hoping to join later on in the conversation, but hasn't yet been able to make it. Hopefully, fingers crossed, he will join later on. Clara Gisoldo is Joint Coordinator of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Anti-Corruption and Responsible Tax. She's also Head of Office for Lloyd Hatton MP. Andrew Penhale is a former Chief Crown Prosecutor at the Crown Prosecution Service's Serious Economic Organised Crime and International Division. And Sophie Davis is the Director of Research at Crest Advisory. We'll be hearing from all of them very shortly, but first I'd like to introduce my colleague James Bolton-Jones. James is Spotlight's Senior Advocacy and Policy Advisor, and this tracker is very much his brainchild. So who better to explain what it is, what it does, and why we decided that we needed to build it. Over to you, James.
Thanks, Alex. So first of all, I would like to thank our consultant, Glyn Mottershead, who designed and implemented the tracker, which I hope people agree. He's done a really fantastic job, so thanks very much, Glyn. And I'll be very brief, as like Alex said, we have a fantastic panel and we're all very keen to hear their observations. So I'll start with a quick word on why we decided to develop the tracker. So a key focus for Spotlight on Corruption is on monitoring how effective the UK's law enforcement agencies are at enforcing against corruption and related economic crimes. But in our experience, finding statistics on anti-corruption enforcement can be pretty tricky, often requiring delving into fairly complex Excel pivot tables that don't work very well if you're using an Apple computer. So we see the tracker as a modest attempt to make this public data easier to access for policymakers and the wider public, give insights into how the UK is doing on anti-corruption enforcement, and highlight what data isn't currently publicly available. And it's worth noting that this is just the first stage of the tracker. Going forward, we have big plans to visualise other stuff, including AML supervision data and resourcing of individual law enforcement agencies and how that's changed over time. In terms of what the tracker actually does, I will give a very quick demonstration now, if it works. Hopefully my screen share looks like it's working. So we've got a homepage here, which kind of has some of the key metrics. We've got prosecutions and convictions for key offences, including money laundering, fraud, bribery, and misconduct in public office. Asset recovery, kind of overall assets recovered since 2013-14, and then fines and the number of fines for breaches of the money laundering regulations. Then we've got 4 individual trackers on money laundering. So this is the money laundering one. We've got data both on a principal offence basis, so when money laundering was the most serious offence prosecuted, and we've got that under the different sections of the Proceeds of Crime Act and the money laundering regulations. And then we've also got money laundering on an all offence basis, so every single money laundering offence that was prosecuted, even if it wasn't the most serious offence in that particular case, and with the same data. And we've got bribery enforcement as well. So looking at different bribery offences over time, overall fraud offences. There we go. But also specific offences that we feel there's quite a lot of overlap with corrupt acts. And then finally, asset recovery. So different asset recovery routes. Here we go. All of them here. Confiscation orders, forfeiture orders, etc. And then the value of the assets recovered and the number of orders that were made. So I'll leave it there. Stop the screen sharing. But yeah, maybe the last thing to say is that we're really keen to hear feedback on users of the tracker, and we're also really grateful for those who have already fed back on the beta version of the tracker, which we incorporated all that feedback, which is really, really helpful. And any suggestions on what the tracker should cover next would also be very welcome. So I will now hand back over to Alex.
Yeah, thanks very much, James. And just to reiterate that the tracker is now live. You can find it on www.spotlightcorruption.org. In the top navigation bar, you'll see the link there, and then you can select the various bits that you're interested. So do have a play around it, and thank you, James, for posting the link in the chat there. Right, we've got a fantastic panel with us, so let's get underway and see what they have to say for themselves. I'm going to do a couple of rounds of questions. The first one is about what the available data tells us about the state of enforcement against corruption and economic crime in the UK right now. I'm going to start with Oliver, if that's okay, Oliver. So Oliver, to what extent do you think that the trends shown in the enforcement tracker reflect that our response to economic crime and corruption is perhaps out of step with the scale of the problem?
Yeah, thanks, everyone. So much to talk about here, and massive credit to James and the Spotlight crew for having put this together. It's a really super useful tool, and I think it's going to be, well, hopefully, going on year after year, it will show the gradual improvement of our efforts fighting financial crime, which will be an inevitable consequence of all of our remorseless activism. But I don't know, I mean, what to talk about? I have 2 things to point out. I mean, one, I think perhaps some of us have been a little bit unfair about the Bribery Act. I've heard the Bribery Act referred to as Britain's Loch Ness monster of legislation, in that we've all heard of it, but none of us have seen it. But actually, it has appeared, it has occasionally broken from the water, but only on very small number of occasions. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens with that going forward. But I think the really important chart to look at is this one on fraud. Sorry, I have my scribbles all over it. I'm absolutely amazed by the collapse in both fraud prosecutions and fraud convictions over the last decade or so. I mean, it's going down from 18,000 plus prosecutions down to barely more than 4,000 over a decade. We knew it was bad, but to be honest, I had no idea it was that bad. There's quite a famous quote from the systems theorist Stafford Beer: "The purpose of a system is what it does." And I think we hear an awful lot about how our economic crime system does all sorts of marvelous things, but if measured on pure output, this is a real remarkable litany of failure over a really long time. I think it's a legacy of underinvestment that's going to be really hard to turn around. And particularly if you combine it with the the crime survey and just the incidence of fraud. The incidence of fraud in the year up to September 2024, 3.9 million incidents of fraud in the survey, which is up almost 20% on the year before. So we've got, I don't know, just a very crude back of a piece of A4 paper calculation. That's approximately a 1 in 1,000 chance of being caught if you're a fraudster, which is another way of saying it's essentially a free hit for any criminal. And I think that should be a wake-up call for anyone, to be honest. I'm appalled by that. And so once again, huge props to James for doing this, because I really hope this is going to make some people sit up.
Fantastic, Olo. Thanks very much. On the subject of getting people to sit up and take notice, a question for Clara. What trends do you think in the tracker do you think will be most interesting to parliamentarians who are focusing on the UK's fight against economic crime?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And I'd just like to echo what Oliver's just said, thanking Spotlight for putting this tracker together. I've already used it to prepare briefs, and I know it's going to be a really invaluable resource for APPG members and hopefully for parliamentarians more broadly. So to the question, I think the headline numbers will be of most interest, and not only because parliamentarians tend to focus on big numbers. I think the overall plummeting numbers of prosecutions that Oliver mentioned in money laundering and fraud prosecutions are really striking and shocking. And so either economic crime has plummeted over the last decade, which we know is not the case, or we're failing to enforce our laws and therefore failing to effectively deter economic crime from occurring in the first place. Yeah, I know that this is of great concern for members of the APPG who are carefully considering what we need to do to give enforcement agencies the tools and the means to go after the organisations and individuals that facilitate or commit economic crime. And yeah, we've got kind of policy recommendations in the Economic Crime Manifesto, but I think this just gives even more of an evidence basis in support of those recommendations. On the other side, I know that parliamentarians will also look at the increase in asset recovery trend of nearly 36%. And yeah, 243 million recovered just last year. I think they'll look at that with interest in the currently fiscally constrained environment. MPs may see this as a way to bring in revenue to the exchequer, but hopefully mainly to fund agencies more sustainably to increase our capabilities to fight economic crime. And I'll just end by saying that I'd be interested to see if the cost protections that have recently been introduced or are being introduced by the government, if that will have an effect on the appetite of enforcement agencies to ramp up asset recovery efforts, and if that will kind of show up on the tracker. But I know that parliamentarians are also looking at other options to incentivise asset recovery and to be more ambitious to go after asset recovery. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Clara. I'm going to turn now to Andrew. Andy, I mean, as a former Chief Crown Prosecutor, there's a lot of data here and it refers to cases, in aggregate. But you, of course, have been involved in the very detail of some of these cases at an individual level. Are you at all surprised by any of these sort of overarching trends that it reveals?
I'm not surprised in the sense that I've seen this data before, and so it doesn't come as anything new. But it is absolutely shocking, as Oliver and Clara have already kind of indicated. And reflects very poorly on what is, where our law enforcement priorities are. As Oliver said, fraud accounts for 41% of all crime, and yet it accounts for 1% of all criminal prosecutions, probably less than 1% of all criminal prosecutions. Part of the reason for that is that police resourcing also accounts for only about 1% or rather 1% of police resourcing is dedicated towards fraud investigations, and the level of policing resource has significantly dropped over the period of the tracker, which I think accounts for a significant amount of the drop that's revealed on the fraud graph. There was also a huge fall off in 2020 caused by COVID, and things have picked up since then. And I've got to give credit to colleagues in the Home Office and the National Economic Crime Centre of the NCA and City of London Police. Unfortunately, Jim's not with us today, because they put in a lot of work to try and buck that trend, to kind of raise fraud awareness and to improve the UK response on it. So I think there are sort of positives going forward, which will hopefully change that picture, and hopefully, as this excellent tracker is developed over time, it will reveal an improved and improving picture. But I'm not surprised by the overall drop. I should add as well that the figures revealed on the fraud graph will also be affected by some slightly changed policies, particularly by DWP. So DWP back in 2013-14 were prosecuting about 10,000 cases a year. Now those numbers have dropped significantly, but for good reasons, because prosecuting very low level DWP prosecutions of people who probably don't have a huge amount, I would argue, is not necessarily a good resource. And in addition, HMRC used to prosecute about 1,000 cases a year at the start of the period covered by the tracker, and their approach has changed as well, and they're very much focused on more top-end fraud rather than the volume things to shift to affect change.
Fantastic, Andy. Thanks very much for bringing some of your expertise and experience to that. Question now for Sophie. At Crest Advisory, you look at the work of the criminal justice system as a whole, as well as in relation to serious organised crime. How do the trends in the tracker compare to broader criminal justice outcomes in the UK?
Yeah, thanks, Alex, and thanks again for inviting me. And like others, I think the tracker looks great, so well done for developing it. Looking at wider trends, I would say that over the last decade, we've seen generally a kind of worsening of outcomes across the criminal justice system. So just to give you a few stats and starting further upstreams, last year the charge rate, so that's the percentage reported crime that results in a charge or a summons, was just under 6%. And that's a continuation of a long-term downward trend from about 16% about 10 years ago. Similarly, what we call the positive outcome rates for forces, which is, again, the rate of reported crimes that results in the positive outcomes are slightly wider than a charge rate, is just at about 11%, and that's also down from about 25% 10 years ago. Investigations are taking a lot longer, so they take about 6 weeks now, up from about 2 weeks in 2016. And similarly, the time it takes from offence to case completion has also increased significantly over the last decade, from about 480 days back in just before the pandemic to just under 700 days now on average. And looking specifically at prosecutions and convictions, they also experienced a significant decline between 2014 and about 2020-21. We've seen a bit of a resurgence in the last few years, which is a really positive trend, but still kind of remains lower than it was about 10 years ago. So sorry, that's quite a lot of stats, but I thought it'd be helpful to provide a bit of an overview. And there's a number of factors that kind of underline all of these trends. And obviously looking at crime in general is not exactly comparable to economic crime in particular, particularly because I know that the cases that we are most focused on with the tracker are the kind of less frequent and more complex cases. But I think there's still factors that underline these trends more generally. One of them is a significant decline in funding and funding restrictions across agencies over the last decade, and that's been mentioned in passing already in relation to the police. I think another one is the complexity of cases. So across serious organised crime, but kind of more generally, we see cases that have an international element, but also that involve digital evidence, and sometimes kind of like a police resource that lacks the skill to respond to that as effectively as it could. Backlogs in the courts, and the criminal courts in particular, is now at 73,000, which is much higher than it was even before the pandemic, and is already quite high. And then that's linked, I think, to kind of issues in the wider system. So one thing that we try and highlight a lot of Crest is how issues in one part of the criminal justice system have an impact on other parts. So when you think about backlogs which create delays, that means that victims and witnesses can kind of drop out. The defendants are less likely to plead guilty early on. That results in fewer kind of convictions in the end and greater delays. So all kind of parts of all issues within the system have impacts on the kind of wider system. And more broadly, I think the impact of kind of worsening outcomes is also shared between these different kinds of crime. And those are a lack of or a worsening in trust and confidence in the wider criminal justice system, and also a lack of a deterrent effect, because we know across the criminology literature that having kind of swift and certain punishment is key to deterrence, and we're not really seeing that at the moment.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Sophie. And if anyone listening is particularly interested in some of the problems affecting the prosecution of economic crime, Andy did an amazing report for Spotlight on Corruption that was put out just before Christmas. So do please jump on our website and go and find that. Introduces lots of really interesting data and really good arguments, and indeed some ways of improving the situation. So do check that out. A question now for Lindsay. From the Home Office perspective, which trends would you highlight? And is there any additional context to any of the data that you think might be worth bringing out at this stage, in addition to the stuff that some of the other panelists have already mentioned?
Sure, thank you. So I think, we definitely share the view that shining a light on the data and the outcomes is really important in terms of, providing an evidence base for how we need to change our response. One, I think, as others have said, and thank you, James, for, responding to our feedback already on this, it's actually that year-on-year trend is really important. As others have said, this has been decades of decline, and we are hopeful that we are slowly turning around what is essentially an oil tanker in terms of improving some of these outcomes. So I think that, that the year-on-year kind of focus is really important. To talk about a couple of other things that I think it'd be helpful to consider further. One that we've not talked about at all so far on this call is around supervision. So at the moment, we've just got fines presented on this tracker, and actually, I think what we think is important, and some of the data is already out there, and we'll be bringing it together as well as part of a kind of Economic Crime Plan 2 data publication, is I suppose a more comprehensive measure of compliance across the anti-money laundering system, because fines is only really the sharp end of enforcement. So other things like the recent HMT supervision report that was published, I think, just last month, shows how you can kind of show the full range of enforcement activity broken down by risk, which is a really good new metric, as well as kind of overall compliance. And I think that speaks to how, in the round, it's very difficult to just use one data point to kind of assess health. You really need to kind of see the full picture. The other thing that I would say on fraud, and we are encouraged by, last year's kind of slight increase in prosecutions and convictions, is that 70% of fraud happens overseas. We are not going to deliver traditional criminal justice outcomes against those fraudsters, and the same applies to money laundering. So the other data point that we are planning to kind of share as part of our kind of wider publication is disruptions. So that is a broader metric. It talks about how we might have managed to take servers down. We might have managed to undertake some kind of other offensive capability against fraudsters operating internationally. So disruptions will be a really important metric for us. And we would hope that would also in time translate into the overall CSCW offence volume as well. So that's it from me. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindsay. I'm going to move on to a second round of questions now, which is really about what's missing from the tracker, or rather than what's missing, because it is a project that we've only just started and we've got plenty of plans to add to it, is what more could be added to it to make it an even better resource. So I'm going to start with Clara, if that's okay. Clara, is there any data missing from the tracker that you think should be included to help with parliamentary, obviously from your perspective, but more generally sort of public scrutiny of the UK's performance on tackling economic crime?
Obviously, as you said, there's already so much on the tracker, but I think there's three key areas where parliamentarians could use more evidence to enable them to better scrutinise the government's work. In order to look at implementation of the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, which was obviously a huge piece of legislation that was enacted in the previous parliament, it would be really helpful to have data on Companies House enforcement trends. So we know, for example, from recent revelations published by Dan Needle, from that we saw that while Companies House initially enforced person of significant control regulations through prosecutions, the number of prosecutions has fallen, and only 4 occurred in the latest bit of data that we have, which is for the first quarter of 2023. So having a fuller picture of Companies House efforts would be really useful to help MPs assess the implementation of ECTA. So that's one bit of data that would be really great to have. The second would be looking at sanctions. So the new government made a series of sanctions announcements, including the largest package against Russia and against key kleptocrats and their enablers. And we know that this won't be effective if it isn't enforced. So it would be really helpful to see trends around sanctions enforcement. And yeah, we know that Ofsted, for instance, has issued minimal penalties and imposed fines in less than 1% of cases of breaches since 2016. So yeah, having trends and more info in the sanctions space would be really helpful as well. And then the third bit, which I know James mentioned at the start, is coming, but given timings, I thought I'd just highlight it. We know that the government is currently reviewing responses to the AML supervision consultation, which looked at 4 options to consolidate and improve AML supervision. And so to help members of the APPG and parliamentarians make the case to the new City Minister for the need for ambitious reform, it would be really helpful to have data and trends on levels of AML supervision enforcement. And yeah, I'm aware that data isn't available by individual supervisor, but I think it would be still helpful to have it by sector. So yeah, I think these would all be helpful for the work of members of the APPG, and it's also a bit of a personal shopping list. But yeah, those are the 3 bits that I think would be really helpful for a start.
Many thanks, Clara. We're always happy to respond to people's personal shopping lists at Spotlight. Question now for Andy. Andy, having worked at the coalface of the criminal justice system, do you have any suggestions for how the government could improve the way it collects and publishes criminal justice data, both on economic crime and more broadly? And relatedly, are there any aspects of economic crime prosecution that are not amenable to quantitative analysis that are missing from the tracker? What can't you capture with data, basically?
Yeah, so in relation to the first question, in fact, as your methodology reveals, it is a really problematic thing to do, to gather meaningful data. Just to illustrate that, your description of how you've had to use 2 methods of capturing money laundering to look at principal offence data and non-principal offence data in order to capture the wider picture of offences that are prosecuted, it just highlights that there's a real issue around how data is captured within criminal justice. Police forces across the country have got different computer systems which capture data in a different way. They measure charging slightly differently from how the CPS do, surprisingly, and the CPS capture an altogether different data set from, say, the Ministry of Justice. So bringing those data sets together it's a real challenge for every aspect of government. And Lindsay and her team in the Home Office will know, because when they've looked across this data, it's almost impossible to kind of make any understanding of it. Ideally, we should have an end-to-end system of measuring our criminal justice data that feeds through from the police to the CPS through to the courts. And there was a general plan to introduce a system called Common Platform that might have allowed that to happen. It's still in the process of being built, but I don't know whether it will quite deliver what we would want in terms of data capture. So certainly for the moment, all the different pieces of the criminal justice system are gathering and measuring data separately. So I don't think there is a short answer, but I really admire your efforts to try and pull that together on the tracker, because it is really, really difficult, but it needs doing, absolutely. In relation to quantitative analysis as opposed to qualitative analysis, I think that's a really important point. One of the because it also reflects upon government policy. I mean, one of the issues that certainly when I was a chief working in economic crime, I kept making to politicians is don't just ask for more prosecutions and see that as a metric of a measure of success. Because what that will do is drive behaviours. So if you say to police, well, we want an X number of percentage increase, then they will deliver investigations to generate that increase. But there'll be low level, low impact investigation and prosecutions. And actually what we want is meaningful prosecutions that deliver an impact across a business area that means that will contribute to fraud prevention, for instance, in a wider sense. So actually, I think one of the pieces of qualitative information that would be missing from the tracker is how do you measure the success of a prosecution in a particular area? For instance, you might prosecute a solicitor for failings on money laundering, and what impact does that have in improving anti-money laundering activity across the sector? So that's a really important area. Some points that Lindsay has already mentioned as well around disruptions and the impact of disruptions and the wider prevention work, which is a huge amount of effort goes into that, and coordinating that by the neck. But that's actually really key to delivering a change in the wider public arena of the impacts of fraud. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy. James, I was wondering whether you wanted to come back in and on Andy's comments around the money laundering offences and the principal and non-principal one, because for those people who haven't spent as much time in the data as you have, they might have found that a bit confusing. Do you want to just sort of explain what the difference is and why we decided to cover both?
Good idea, Alex. And I also see there were a couple of comments in the Q&A on this as well, so definitely worth quickly covering. Yeah, basically it's a bit confusing, but the Ministry of Justice publishes prosecution and conviction data in two main ways. So there's the principal offence data set and the principal and non-principal offence data set. The first one only counts prosecutions for the offence that was the most serious in that particular prosecution. So for money laundering, if money laundering carried the heaviest sentence, but there were other offences prosecuted alongside, you would only count money laundering in that particular prosecution. But vice versa, if money laundering wasn't the most serious offence and another offence, say a drugs offence, carried a heavier penalty, then that money laundering offence wouldn't be counted in the principal offence data. By contrast, in the principal and non-principal offence data, that just counts all of the offences across the board. So for money laundering, you would have both the instances where it was the most serious offence prosecuted in a case, but also where it was not the most serious. One of the kind of key distinctions to make between those two data sets is that the first one, you would tend to have the number of defendants prosecuted because you've only got one offence per defendant, whereas in the second version, you would just have all of the offences, which, one defendant can be prosecuted for multiple offences. So it's not as such a good way for counting how many individual defendants there were, in the whole year. So for money laundering, we've included both. We haven't included both for the other three kind of offence areas, so bribery, fraud, and misconduct in public office, mostly because money laundering is often tagged on as, a sort of supplementary offence because money laundering can cover almost any acquisitive crime, so that's lots of different crimes that you can attach a money laundering prosecution to. It's not so much the case for the other prosecutions. However, if people feel really strongly and think that it's not fair to not include the all offence data for the other offences, that we're very open to adding that to the tracker. So yeah, any feedback on that would be really welcome.
Super, James. Thanks very much. There's a really clear explanation of what is a really technical point. A question now for Sophie. Sophie, from your research into serious organised crime, what further data do you think should be collected to allow policymakers to make the most effective interventions? And should this data even be made public?
Yeah, so I mean, it won't surprise you to hear, given that I work in research, that I think more data is generally a good thing, and more public data is generally a good thing. And I think there's, in this area across SOC, I think there's a need for more and better data more generally. And I mean, other panelists have already made reference to the fact that fraud has not received the attention it deserves compared to the scale of the problem. Over the long term, I would agree with Lindsay and others that that's changed over the last few years. But generally, it doesn't deserve quite the attention, doesn't receive quite the attention that it deserves. And I think some of that is due to the way in which we collect data and the amount of data we have. For example, the fact that fraud and economic crime stats are generally excluded from kind of wider crime statistics. And in this area in particular, I know that a number of experts, and including the NCA, have pointed out the fact that money laundering and corruption in particular are areas where we have a kind of weaker understanding of the scale of the threat. In terms of kind of further data that might be needed, this is kind of a bit broader than the tracker. I don't know whether you'd be able to cover it in the tracker, but we've pointed out in our research before the need for greater data on the kind of overlap and interconnectedness between the different kinds of threats within what we understand to be serious organised crime, and particularly thinking about money laundering, illicit finance, corruption as underlying or kind of being a unifying thread, if you want, across all of these threats. I think surfacing that would be particularly helpful. More data and more kind of analysis around the cost, I think, of serious organised crime, corruption, money laundering to society in general. That's something that the Home Office did, but I think we haven't got a figure that it's that figure is kind of quite out of date now, and I think that would really help to have a better understanding of the cost, and particularly the proportion of various threats that are attributable to it. And then lastly, just building on the point that Lindsay made, because one of the key arguments that kind of we made in our research as well is slightly moving away also from those traditional criminal justice outcomes in terms of prosecutions and arrests, because the nature of serious organised crime now make that very difficult to do, as Lindsay was saying. So kind of moving towards the kind of corruption and earlier stage of the process. And so having kind of more data on kind of those disruption techniques, but also generally, and I acknowledge this is very hard to do, on the impacts of measures to try and tackle the threat, and what impact we're having through those, I think would be very beneficial. And I would say, just to finish, that I think that tackling serious organised crime as a whole is key to both the mission on growth and the one on crime. And I think that having more data generally would help to make the case for this.
Super, thanks, Sophia, and really important point to bring out the missions, the government's missions, and how this work can feed into those, because I know that's a constant topic and a constant phrasing that we're always looking to find how these can support the government's missions, not least as a way of influencing policymakers. A question now for Lindsay. ECP2 committed to developing improved performance indicators across a number of actions in the plan, including on improving data on criminal justice outcomes and law enforcement disruptions, which you've already mentioned. How are you getting on with this work, and when can we expect to see more progress on this front, and how would you characterise it?
Yeah, sure. So as you say, one of the commitments in Economic Crime Plan T was to develop this outcomes framework, because we were very keen that we didn't just track whether we've done all the actions in the plan, actually, are we making a difference on outcomes? So we have developed that outcomes framework, which identifies kind of both key short and long-term outcomes from the activity, and what indicators you can use to kind of measure effectiveness. So that is something we are aiming to publish. Kind of classic caveats around, government clearance for the publication, but we are aiming to do that kind of early summer. And then we would seek to do that again, kind of following the conclusion of Economic Crime Plan 2. So the kind of thing that will include is certainly, all of the data points that we've seen here today in the Spotlight tracker, disruptions, sanctions, fraud incidents, to pick up, I think, what we've heard earlier as well about, it's not just kind of volume of criminal justice outcomes, it's also kind of quality. Things like sentence length, which can be used as a bit of a proxy for that, are the other kind of things that we'll be including as well.
Great, thanks very much, Lindsay. I don't think Jim has been able to join us, Jim from the Domestic Corruption Unit. So I'm now going to give Oliver a chance to sort of answer the last question in this sort of panel-y bit, and then we'll move on to some Q&A. But Oliver, from your view as an author and a journalist who closely follows the UK's efforts to tackle corruption and economic crime, is there any data that you think should be published to help generate better public understanding of the problem? And what should the government be doing on that front?
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering about this and just checking into the mix. Wouldn't it be fun to have international comparison data on this tracker? And then hearing James and Andy talking about how hard it was just to compare data within the UK, I thought that possibly, getting information comparing us to, France or Sweden or wherever would be, several steps beyond what was even possible, let alone desirable. So anyway, leaving that aside, I'd be interested in a slightly possibly wider definition of corruption, perhaps to include electoral offences in there as well. It might be interesting to see what that's doing. There's a lot of, well, it might just be me, but I think there's a lot of public concern around that at the moment. In the context of what's been happening in other European countries and in the US. So a bit of focus on what's happening around electoral offences would be interesting to see that. And then I think in terms of what the government's response is, perhaps information on the government's response. How much funding goes into fighting economic crime. I know Spotlight has put together some figures on that in the past. I mean that would be interesting to see. The number of officers or other staff tackling financial crime, those sort of full-time figures for that would be really interesting over time. Perhaps the number of vacancies, which are as well, would be interesting. One issue that I hear a lot from officers is about wage levels in different forces, and the difficulties that was, and perhaps compared, to a sort of, representative figure in the private sector in, an equivalent position in compliance or whatever might be interesting. And then finally, I mean, we heard earlier about, the significance of the backlog in the courts and the length of time, to come to trial. That I think also, I think these are all relevant things in terms of what it is that's preventing more prosecutions and being brought and more convictions being gained against economic crime. It's why it is so hard. It isn't just about the fact that, the majority of frauds happen overseas, though obviously that is an issue. We are not doing a good enough job in this country as well. And I think that anything that allows members of the public to get a better understanding of the reasons behind that is good. There was a line that the Obama White House used to use, which was that all data that isn't secret should be public. And I think that anything that makes data, publicly accessible in an easy to understand way is incredibly valuable. And particularly around this area, which people can think that economic crime is too complicated to think about. It's too, it's jargon ridden. So anything, I mean, like these charts, that just make what's happening very clear and very obvious to understand, I just think is incredibly valuable. So, thanks for doing it. And, as I've said, I think to you before, James, I'm really good at coming up with things for other people to do. So, there you go. I've just done that a bit more.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Oliver. We're always happy to take advice for people like yourselves on what we should be looking at, and we're very happy to get stuck into it. Well, thanks very much to the panel. Brilliant answers so far. We have got about 15 minutes for Q&A, which I'm delighted about. So James has very kindly picked out some of the first batch of questions from the Q&A. I'm going to start with the first one, which is an anonymous question. What's the panel's view on the Law Commission's recommendations that 2 statutory offences should replace the common law offence of misconduct in public office? 1, an offence of corruption in public office, and 2, an offence of breach of duty in public office. Would this improve prosecution rates? I'll bounce that over to Andy at first, but if any other members of the panel want to come in, then do please let me know. Andy.
Well, the short answer is yes. I think it should. The government should follow the Commission's recommendation, not necessarily exactly those offences. I think they're worth looking at further. But the offence of misconduct in public office is a really difficult offence to prosecute, and I think it needs updating. There needs to be a broader definition of corruption and corrupt activity captured by the offence, and of clarity around where that applies to individuals and in what circumstances. So the short answer is yes, I think that will be a good thing. Whether there's government time or desire to do that remains to be seen.
Thanks, Andy. Any other panel member willing to chip in on that, or should we move on to the next question? Looks like we'll move on. Okay. So second question, also an anonymous question. Given the difficulties and complexities associated with gathering evidence for fraud and bribery offences, is it not better to pursue asset recovery rather than traditional criminal justice outcomes? Sophie, maybe you could start with that one, and then maybe other members of the panel might have views.
Yeah, so I think two things. The first is what I've kind of said before, which I think, yes, we probably need to, like, prosecutions and convictions, I think, remain incredibly important. But we also need, as Lindsay was saying, to kind of focus much more upstream. And that's kind of disruption at a much greater scale in terms of making the wider environment much harder for criminals to operate in. So I think we kind of need both. We still need to have the kind of prosecution and conviction end of the spectrum, but we also need to go much more upstream. And yes, we do need to pursue asset recovery. I think that is an incredibly complicated system at the moment, which also would benefit from improvements. And also, we recommended, as I think Spotlight has, that more of the proceeds that are recovered through asset recovery is kept by the law enforcement agencies as a means of incentivizing asset recovery even more. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sophie. Oliver, it looks like you've got something to add.
Yeah, I'm a big enthusiast for perhaps doing things which are not particularly fashionable and bringing in the private sector on asset recovery. I think I can totally understand why it's considered to be very icky to, like, essentially empower bounty hunters to go around and behave as if they're in the Wild West. But we are, even though, to be fair, I mean, I did pick out at the beginning a couple of bad figures, but the asset recovery figures are showing improvement, and that's really good. But I think the figures remain just a fraction of what we should be getting in an ideal world. So I think we have one thing we're very good at in this country is having some really ferocious lawyers. And if we could turn some of the lawyers who perhaps are, making their fees by working for the oligarchs and turn them around and say, why don't you go after the oligarchs? And if you do, then you get to keep, X% of what you come back with. Then I think that could come back with some really valuable results. So, yeah, I mean, obviously it would be preferable if we were able to do it all in the public sector, but I don't think that's going to happen. So more, private sector involvement, which would involve people being able to make profits from it. It would be a bit of a tough political sell. I understand that, but I do think that the results would be in the end, taking money away from criminals, which is what we want to happen. So, I think that in the long run, the results would be beneficial.
Great, thanks, Oliver. Next question is about domestic corruption, and it's actually a real shame that Jim isn't with us, because obviously this is really his bag. But another anonymous question: does the panel believe that the UK really has a problem with domestic corruption? Is the data presented in the tracker the tip of the iceberg? Oliver, I'll maybe throw that one back to you to start off with, but maybe any other panelists could raise their hands, and I'll bring them in too.
I confess I don't have any insight on a direct level about that. But I mean, it is. I mean, I'm sure we've all been, following the series about the House of Lords that the Guardian's been running recently. It does seem surprisingly easy for journalists in a fairly flimsy disguise to persuade politicians to do things for money, which does suggest that this is not, perhaps an entirely alien concept in the corridors of power. I also think that the decline in local media means that there is a whole level of politics in this country that goes almost entirely unscrutinized and set by private eye. So, it's definitely, I think, something that we should be more aware of and more concerned about, because, the consequences of corruption once it becomes entrenched are, not least that it's bad in its own terms, but it becomes very difficult to uproot once it's become entrenched. So, I do think that's something that there should be more attention to. And yeah, I'm also sorry that Jim's not here, because I'd be really interested to hear what he had to say about that.
Thanks, Oliver. Andy.
Yeah. So I think it's. I think there's always been an assumption in this country that somehow we don't really have a corrupt operation of government, and we don't really have a corrupt culture in our business environment. And I think that's been a sort of rather complacent and misleading assumption to make, because actually there are quite a few instances where that corruption's uncovered. I think in local authorities there's a real risk, and there's a couple of prosecutions undergoing at the moment, but I think there's a wider picture of concern. You need to look at the data generated by Transparency International, looking at COVID and the procurement exercises around that. Makes you think, well, actually, there's some underlying issues which have not been properly explored. Whether they will be in the COVID inquiry remains to be seen. But I think we've been very complacent in this country around domestic corruption. So I'm delighted that there's been a domestic corruption unit set up under Jim. It's only very recently been set up. It's very small, and they're underway. But it's about time. We've had that in most. We've had an international corruption unit and units in the Met and City of London Police in the past for years and years, but we've never really had a coordinated look at domestic corruption, and I think it's about time. Just whilst I'm still on speaker, I should also mention as well on the asset recovery front that there is quite a lot of work done on around civil recovery. I know Adrian Foster's on the call, so he would shoot me down if I didn't mention the fact that the CPS have got some really active civil asset recovery work and have had some success. And also, if you look at both the work of the SFO and the CPS in generating money for deferred prosecution agreements, which I know not everyone agrees with, but actually is a huge revenue earner, and I think of quite an effective way of dealing with serious corporate corruption.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andy, on both of those points. Lindsay.
I was going to make a similar point, actually, just to draw attention to the new domestic corruption unit that was announced back in December. So I won't kind of opine on where potentially the greatest risk is, but I do think it is very broad potentially. And I think it would, and exactly as just said there, the reason that we felt we needed to support work with City of London Police to set that up was because the other bits of the system response were more geared internationally. So I think in terms of focus of this group, it'd be really helpful to kind of remain interested in tracking the output of that unit. So both from a kind of data perspective and engaging with Jim about how he's getting on in the future.
Great stuff. Thanks, Lindsay. I think you might be in line to answer this next question as it comes up. So let me just read that one out. It's a question from Heather Marquette. From a policymaking prioritisation and political will basis, it would be useful to disaggregate between crimes originating in the UK and crimes originating overseas, and then for those overseas where by country and region. These aren't directly comparable, and without this, the data will likely always show disappointing performance, even when UK law enforcement may be doing everything it can, both at home and overseas, with different outcomes reflecting different feasibility of the response. Anything you'd like to add to that, Lindsay?
Yes, I mean, I completely agree that the response needs to be targeted based on the jurisdictions of risk. So we do have tier 1 priority countries for jurisdictions of risk for money laundering, and similarly for fraud. I won't kind of name and shame them on this call, but again, we have that kind of top 5 for fraud, and very specific kind of country action plans linked to that. Some and in some areas you can work collaboratively with those jurisdictions, where you might have kind of shared areas of interest as well. So I completely agree that is very kind of critical to the response and exactly how we go about it on that kind of upstream international work. Disaggregating the data, I think is probably unrealistic. We can certainly do it in terms of scale and risk, but actually trying to break it down to volume of offences and volume of prosecutions and disruptions, I think, given the other complexities we've talked about here, trying to get into that level of detail, I don't think it's going to happen, to be honest.
Super, thanks, Lindsay. I think we've probably got time for one, maybe 2 more questions. This is another anonymous question. Does the panel have a view on why the Bribery Act has failed to capture more instances of wrongdoing, as evidenced by the lack of prosecutions? Perhaps Oliver or Sophie, so maybe Oliver first and then Sophie?
Well, I mean, it might just be that everyone's really honest. Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that, I'm afraid.
Sophie, anything to add? Oh, we lost Sophie. Maybe we have. Okay, all right. Well, in that case, let's skip on to probably the last question now. Another anonymous question. Sorry, Andy, did you want to?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say very quickly. I mean, I think that's to do with him. It's not a problem with the Bribery Act. The Bribery Act is a perfectly good piece of legislation and has been used effectively. It's all about investigative resource and also, I think, a reporting mechanism which just encourages people to report and knowing that it will be investigated. And I don't think, whilst there is some culture of that, I don't think that's really well embedded.
Brilliant, thanks, Andy. So one final question, which is going to be for Clara, I think. Another anonymous question. Given the importance of whistleblowers in revealing corruption and internal fraud in government or businesses, would the UK benefit from an Office of the Whistleblower to help channel triage evidence for enforcement agencies? Clara, anything on that?
Yeah, the APPG is really interested in how we can best support kind of whistleblowers to come forward as they face risks, obviously, from an employment perspective, in coming out and reporting wrongdoing. We're looking at establishing an office for the whistleblower, which is one option, but then also rewards. And I know that David Lammy, as part of his 5 or 6 point plan that he announced right before the election, he was looking specifically at rewards for whistleblowing, kind of following a US model. So yeah, I guess kind of watch the space. I know there's also an amendment to the Employment Rights Bill going through that looks at this problem specifically. So yes, hopefully that will come soon.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Clara. We are almost exactly on time, and I know everyone's super busy and have probably got things to move on to. So all that remains is for me to thank our brilliant panelists for sharing all of their thoughts with us today. It was a really tremendous session. Big thanks from me to my 2 colleagues, James, and particularly to Catherine, who's been managing everything in the background to make sure it all's gone very smoothly, and fingers crossed it has. But most of all, an enormous thank you from all of us at Spotlight on Corruption to every one of you who've joined us today. I hope you enjoyed the session as much as we did, and do let us know if you've got any kind of feedback. So thanks again, and goodbye.